So today we get to talk about why the FBI was investigating a organization for its trading card practices, and I never thought I'd get a chance to say that. So this is interesting. But before we talk about why PSA and PWCC, one of eBay's largest auction houses, got subpoenaed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, let's roll that intro. Hey Gengar Gang, what is going on? My name is Ryan, this is the Analytic Gengar, and welcome to another video. In today's video, friends, we go over the PWCC scam that has taken the internet and set it on fire. Now, a lot of people are actually quite surprised to find out that the FBI has a history of being involved in sports and trading card memorabilia. Now, although this particular topic does not very specifically apply to Pokemon cards, today we'll go over the story of why PSA and PWCC, two particular names and organizations that are very related to our hobby, and why and how they ended up working with the FBI in a nationwide investigation about sports card fraud. Now, as I'd mentioned, it doesn't necessarily specifically relate to Pokemon cards, but as our hobby continues to mature as well as grow, we need to be more risk adverse, and this is a classic example of how things can go wrong. Back in the 90s, there was basically a Wild West type of attitude where tons of memorabilia was fraudulently created and sold, meaning autographs, doctoring of trading cards, etc., etc. And the thing is that our hobby, especially over the past 18 months, has grown so much in value, especially specific trading cards, that it is coming to a point where there is a pretty logical reason why someone would want to commit fraud in the Pokemon TCG hobby. So this example from history can help us better understand what goes wrong, and hopefully from this video we might be able to even extrapolate how we go about preventing it. Now, as always, all of the articles and websites that are visited in today's video will be down below in the description, and if not, that means I forgot to add them when I was uploading to YouTube, so just let me know either down below in the comments or by getting in touch, and I'll point you to the websites applicable. Shout out to Cardlines, they, it's their website, so I feel the need to acknowledge that. And definitely some really cool articles there, so if you guys want to see more, or if there are ones in the corner that you think catch your eye, definitely let me know, and I can also look into doing those as videos as well. But without further ado, let's get right into it with a recap of the article. Now, this article is as of May 31st, 2021, so relatively recent, but, all things considered, the story is actually historic at best, and so it's actually pretty neat. Now, this article takes a pretty hard stance right off the bat. PWCC is not good. PWCC, in case you don't know, is a auction house on eBay that also runs a whole bunch of other auctions. Basically, you give them your cards and co-sign with them, meaning they sell it on your behalf. There's no knowledge of who the seller is, and they basically charge you a fee but take care of everything in between. PWCC also has a vault, which has become a relatively popular option for some collectors. Basically, you send your stuff in, they lock it away, it's fully insured, it's fully kept safe and sound, and you basically don't have to worry about keeping it in the house where your kid is going to grab it one day and start chewing on the acrylic or something like that. So the good news is that PWCC is a pretty common name both in the sports card hobby as well as in the Pokemon TCG. Over the past couple of months, they have certainly made a name for themselves, selling some very high dollar amounts when it comes to Pokemon cards, and perhaps unsurprisingly, many of their sales are what fuel some record-breaking prices for different cards, including first edition Charizards, various Gold Stars, and other vintage cards. So they're kind of a big deal, but this story perhaps doesn't get as much coverage as it should, and it's a classic example of why you can't simply ignore the bad that a company does if, in fact, it casts their entire operation in a bad light and further contextualizes what their motivations are. So let's get into it. As you can see, the first section is Operation Bullpen. Now, to give you a basic rundown of the story so far, in the 90s, the FBI Chicago branch of the Bureau ended up following some severe fraud in the sports memorabilia industry, and they started Operation Foul Ball, which was meant to capture that. But Operation Foul Ball soon grew into a nationwide investigation that they renamed Operation Bullpen. So Operation Bullpen is in fact the actual FBI operation that we're going to talk about today. So the FBI sets up some undercover investigations and things of that nature, including but not limited to a trading card company that they can then use to basically, like, you know, figure some stuff out, get some really weird and unscrupulous characters to interact with them, basically setting up undercover agents to buy stuff that, you know, was bootlegged, was forged, was doctored in some way, shape, or form. And the FBI mainly focused on autographs, again, sports memorabilia specifically, but happenstantially, because they were hanging around with bad guys anyway, they ended up finding 2 counterfeiting card rings that were also dismantled. So the card portion of the industry is relatively unencumbered, says the FBI, by fraud, but these 2 rings are considered anomalies. What that basically means is, hey, you know, we're targeting sports memorabilia. Just so happens we caught some guys doing some stuff to cards as well. We shut them down, but what we find is overall the card stuff isn't as perverse as the signature and autograph stuff is. So just to kind of contextualize that. Now, I actually even chased down this hyperlink, which actually opens up to the FBI's website, and you can see the actual entire story. And this is as of a story of 2005. I don't know when it was actually archived versus when it was an active story on the website's page, but what you do know is that this is archived material from the FBI website, and it may contain outdated information or links that no longer function. You can read through this. Again, I will have this linked down below, and you can see the entire story of how Operation Foul Ball ended up becoming a real-life operation. You can see there was autographed memorabilia from Michael Jordan that kind of kicked this stuff off. But if you look right over here, we're still looking at it. Aha, right there. So there were 13 forgery rings that were dismantled and were investigated with approximately 1/5 of the manpower, I guess all of the different resources the FBI was willing to dedicate to this. 2 counterfeiting rings were also dismantled, so just like the article says, it's a literal direct quote. The FBI, at least as of the date of this article when it was archived, said the card portion of the industry is relatively unencumbered by fraud, and these 2 rings are considered anomalies. So that's interesting, because what that basically amounts to is them saying, hey, don't worry about it, it's not as crazy or perverse as the autograph stuff is. Now, just to kind of briefly highlight what Operation Bullpen did, in case anyone's curious, there were 63 charges and convictions. They seized over $4.9 million in assets. 18 forgery rings were dismantled, including the 2 for the sports cards. Over $300,000 was in restitution was paid, meaning if and when they caught someone who was selling this fake stuff and they had a customer that they sold this stuff to, they'd be ordered to pay the actual value amount. And then over $15 million in economic loss was prevented because the FBI definitely, you know, articulates that, hey, this is a pretty large industry, and therefore a lot of potential fraud was prevented because of their actions. So that's a summary of Operation Bullpen, and you'd think that the 2 rings are considered anomalies would have nothing more to do, and that's where this video ends. Au contraire, one of those anomalies was PWCC. So the thing with PWCC is that they started posting some altered vintage baseball cards and Blowout Cards, which by the way is a website you can buy trading cards from. I've actually purchased my Flashfire 144 blister packs from them. So Blowout Cards also has a forum website, and that forum website is actually a pretty active and honestly amazing community. So they started noticing several altered vintage baseball cards in PSA slabs that were being sold on PWCC. And much like any internet theory, this was done over the course of a couple of different weeks, as well as with some pretty extensive documentation and evidence being presented throughout those discussions. So, you know, much like one of those very well thought out Instagram posts, this was another one of those things where there was a pretty compelling case being assembled by forum members. Now, PWCC at first refuses to take the auction down. Then their CEO gets on there and says that if there's no evidence of anything having been done to the card is not altered, it's being conserved. Now, that definition right there just drew the entirety of the ire of the internet, because what you're basically saying is you can alter cards, you can fix cards, you can doctor cards, as long as you don't get caught doing so. And unfortunately, what that means when you're the CEO of an auction house is that we're willing to sell this stuff because we're going to define it as not being altered, but rather being conserved. Long story short, it's a huge problem, because what it means is that PWCC is basically saying, hey, doctor your cards, just don't get caught doing it, and we'll sell them. Now, interestingly enough, users then traced some of the cards that they thought were being doctored or had alleged were doctored to a Long Island card fraudster named GaryMoser. Now, Gary has denied all allegations, has never been charged with anything that has stuck anyway, and he has been accused of systematically altering genuine sports cards. Basically, he'll take a busted up older card and trim the edges, recolor, or do anything and everything he possibly can to make it get a better grade. And in fact, that is his actual gimmick. So he would buy trading cards, and you can see right here in the article it says as much. He would buy them from PWCC, break them out of their slabs, they would go under some sort of combination of his doctoring. So they would get trimmed, they would be chemically brightened, they would be ironed to eliminate wrinkles, and then he would resubmit them to PSA. They would get better grades because he's actually very good at doctoring cards. And then he would flip them on PWCC for arguably hundreds of thousands of dollars. And of course, PWCC charges for their services, so it may even be a chance that PWCC charged a premium because they knew what he was up to, and therefore ended up in a really, really good situation where, long story short, he gets a lot of money, PWCC gets a lot of money, and someone gets a card that has legitimately been tampered with in order to improve its condition. Now, technically, one could argue that doctoring is conserving, but that's literally the argument that Brent Huggins, the PWCC CEO, made. Technically, if a card's condition is diminished, it should be left alone, and it should get the grade that it gets, period, end of story. Anything done to alter that card to improve its condition is what they call card doctoring. So, the article goes on to note, like, hey, there are many trimmers and card refurbishment experts who co-sign cards at institutions like PWCC. By nature, their name is no longer associated with the card because it's going to the auction house where it's being sold. So, you never technically know what's happening when you sell a card over there. You're just hoping that the grade of the card is legit and that nothing's been done. So yeah, that's the story of how GaryMoser basically infiltrated the the sports card hobby and was fraudulently altering cards in order to get better grades and make hundreds of thousands of dollars. And of course, PSA and PWCC both are involved because those are the two vehicles through which he went ahead and made his thousands of dollars. So, the FBI receives complaints and they begin an investigation that falls under Operation Bullpen, which was that FBI investigation and operation that we were talking about earlier in the video. So it falls under the context and pretext of that particular investigation, and the FBI in July of 2019, which isn't that long ago, subpoenas PWCC. They basically say, hey, you gotta talk to us because legally you're required to do so, especially if you had knowledge of the fraud. Now, the FBI starts looking into Moser, PWCC, and PSA, so the auction house, the grading company, and the person who was doing the doctoring. And it seems like, at least from this article, that the two companies flip on Moser and say, hey, we're just gonna cooperate with the FBI, we don't want no smoke, dog. Totally understood. PWCC then proceeds to release a statement. They throw Moser under the bus. They're very aware of the issues surrounding the cards submitted to us by GaryMoser. We understand that we're responsible in our part for this mess, and we'll make it right for the people who have, purchased an altered card. And then PWCC strenuously denied knowledge of, Moser's antics. There is, however, overwhelming evidence that they are lying. It appears that the CEO knew and profited from Moser's alleged fraudulent activities. Now, the FBI hasn't divulged any details into their investigation, and it seems like because PWCC and PSA decided to cooperate, that the FBI basically dropped any and all pursuits that they had against either of the two companies because they were cooperating and more or less helping to prosecute or gather evidence on Moser. So the idea here is they get off scot-free because the FBI gets to nail GaryMoser for his card doctoring, which is probably the strongest case that they have, but also probably one of the easiest and most clear-cut avenues to take to make sure that the fraud stops. So the thing is that you would think the story ends there. You would hope PWCC and PSA stopped all of their sort of nefarious activity, and you would hope that, they're on the up and up now. But the article goes on to detail PWCC's back at it. So they started listing some additional cards and leave it to our friends at the Blowout Forum to immediately question its authenticity. But these are the same members that broke the scandal in 2019, so they know what they're talking about, and if the FBI is able to validate what they're speaking about, they probably have the authority to do so. Now, they go on to point out this particular GIF of a card right here that basically shows one of the cards that has changed a little bit before and after. So really interesting to see how that Tom Brady rookie card has, kind of changed in some weird ways. And a lot of people were like, hey man, what's up with that? That seems like a really weird change for a card. So instead of taking the listing down, PWCC puts a disclaimer on it saying, hey, be advised, this was probably listed for sale. A question was raised about the accuracy of the grade. It was resubmitted to PSA for their technical review. You can see that right there. And then under review, PSA confirmed the grade it got in conformity with its current grading standards. It's now being presented again on the marketplace. In other words, PWCC is claiming that they had the cards reviewed by PSA after the scandal broke. So, what does that mean? Well, one of two things is happening here. Either PWCC still has cards in their possession, either via the vault or, stuff that they have that's inventory, that they're now trying to sell after the scandal with GaryMoser that may have been altered or edited in some way, shape, or form. The thing is that they're now sort of going about the process of maybe listing some of these cards after they have been altered and having gotten a higher grade. So here's a good example. There's a card, it sold in 2013 as an SGC3 for $358.50. GaryMoser gets his hands on that card sometime after 2013 and then alters it and then grades it with PSA and then submits it to PWCC. However, in 2019, the scandal breaks, they hit the brakes on selling this card, and they hold it for a little bit. Then in 2021, PWCC lists the exact same card in its altered form for $17,500. So you can see the huge increase in price and the fact that it's potentially related to GaryMoser and the FBI investigation for Operation Bullpen, etc., etc. Now, the card was eventually removed and the post received a good deal of traction, so long story short, PWCC got a lot of negative attention for this and basically got, blown up about it. So that Tom Brady card, ironically enough, may have signaled the next big drama for PWCC as an auction house. So, it looks like the company is taking trim cards that remain in their stock before the scandal broke and is now selling them now that the heat has sort of died down a little bit. They believe they might have found some sort of legal loophole in their cooperation agreement with the FBI, but I basically agree with this statement that says if you think the FBI is going to leave you alone after they came very close to probably pinning you up against the wall and getting charges laid out against PWCC and certain individuals as an organization, I have a very strong feeling that they're just going to draw the ire of another investigation and potentially do a lot more harm for themselves than there is good. Now, PSA's role in the scandal is a smaller section, but basically it goes on to say that PSA will review your cards for authenticity, and then will go ahead and flag ones that have evidence of doctoring, such as recoloring or trimming. Now, the thing is that our friends at Blowout, as well as, I don't know, everyone in every hobby ever that interacts with PSA, knows that occasionally they have oversights. A card gets graded lower than it should have, or higher than it should have, etc., etc. Technically, these should be once in a blue moon type of situations, but unfortunately, a lot of people think PSA had to have had a role in this. They frequently get called the leaders in the card authentication and grading space, and to think that they weren't able to catch any of GaryMoser's doctored cards is a little bit of a stretch, because they're supposed to be the experts. They're supposed to catch this stuff. So the argument is that maybe PSA had some inside knowledge of this and look the other way, because they benefit from this too. If GaryMoser is able to sell higher and higher graded cards, it only draws attention to PSA as a company, because their cards are selling for record-breaking prices, as is the usual. So it's one of those things where PSA practically got away scot-free. Basically, all they needed to do was stop running PWCC ads and say, oh, geez, we're sorry for the role we played. It's really unfortunate that our cards were the ones that, didn't get through this. But this isn't really good, because if they knew about it, obviously that's bad. And if they didn't know about it, there's a card doctor out there that was able to get away with grading cards with them. And they're supposed to be the leaders in the space when it comes to authentication. And unfortunately, they're not, because GaryMoser could beat them. And if GaryMoser could do it, there's probably someone else out there who either learned from him or is better than him at card doctoring and could potentially get away with the same. There are additional sections in the article for whether or not actually reviewing the grade and what that means. Basically, PSA has been mum's the word on this stuff. They don't really say anything. One could argue that what PWCC did is basically submit the card for regrading with a minimum grade of like a 7 or whatever the grade of the card was, and in theory, as long as they don't get a higher grade than the quote-unquote grade is reviewed. I don't necessarily know what point that has, but I guess the argument is that PWCC is putting some of the blame on PSA, because then later down the road, if something wrong happens, they can say, oh, well, PSA reviewed it and they were not able to do anything about it. They didn't say it was less or more. So it's PSA's fault, not our fault. Now, long story short, if PSA is knowledgeable about this in any way, shape, or form, that is really, really bad. And if they're not knowledgeable about it, it's still really, really bad. So they seem to have found themselves in quite a bit of a pickle. And like I said, this is one of those topics that doesn't get enough limelight on it, and I think this is one of those things that we genuinely need to talk about, because it could slowly creep into our hobby as well. So the article goes on to wrap up by saying, here's what you should do. Obviously, never buy from PWCC, but be careful of any card favored by GaryMoser, none of which are Pokemon cards, so I guess we're lucky in that capacity. And then, check to see if the PSA certification was ever owned by PWCC, trust but verify, and stay alert for the folks at Blowout forums in case they call out a new scandal that you need to be aware of. As for PWCC, they did refund buyers of certain cards. So if the card was one of the ones that the FBI considered in scope of the investigation, PWCC did help it come to an equitable conclusion by simply refunding those people. But if the allegations are true that they're selling some older doctored cards that they still have in inventory, they're right back on their BS, and that's no bueno either. So there ends the article. And so the next question becomes, how is this relevant to the Pokemon trading card game? Well, our hobby, similar to the sports card hobby in the 90s, is going through a growth period, and it's a pretty robust and strong period. Bear in mind, some Pokemon cards sell consistently for some higher than some of the rare sports trading cards in the world. So again, there should come as no surprise that Pokemon has enough money and finance behind it that fraudsters will act. And we don't know whether they are already acting, if they are planning on acting, or if it's something in between. But what I can say is that when you have cards that are selling for upwards of $100,000 or more, there's certainly tons of reasons why fraudsters would want to get in on this. And that's where the question comes into play. Now, I'm looking at this from a risk aversion standpoint. I'm taking a look at the most riskiest parts of what I predict can be the future, and then I look to see how we can avoid those. And I think this is one of those situations that copy paste and, switch out the baseball or basketball players for Pokemon characters. But I think if you do that, you can have the story play out in a couple of years, and that's not good. So the good news is that, to my knowledge, there are no pronounced card doctors for the Pokemon trading card game. It also helps that we have cards that are blue on back and then have tons of different colors on the front. That means chemical whitening isn't as viable an option for us. The other good thing is that because that blue background chips and becomes white, again, it makes it very hard to doctor the back of a card because it's borderline impossible to do so. The one thing that I have seen covered in a random discussion forum is back replacement. So if the back of a card is busted, there is theoretically a way that you can take a brand new donor card, strip off the back layer of the Pokemon background, and then apply it to the old card. And if done correctly, it could be virtually undetectable and would effectively replace an old, busted, really gross looking back of a card with a brand new back, which in theory could grade better. Now, this is all theory, so this is not an accusation that anybody in our hobby is doing this. However, the only thing to note is that if someone could get away with that, that would be a perfect example of how fraud could be introduced into the Pokemon TCG. So, just something to bear in mind. Again, not an accusation and not saying any of this is happening, but more so something to think about as we continue to grow and develop as a hobby. One of the biggest things that I've been on in this past couple of weeks is how our hobby will mature, because especially as we look to sports memorabilia, it's a hobby that's been around for longer than we have existed as a hobby. And arguably, some of the growing pains they have experienced over the years are some of the same growing pains we may experience as we continue to mature into the 30s, 40s, and 50s of years that we could have been around collecting. So, just something to bear in mind. The other thing, and again, not an accusation, I don't want no smoke, I don't want it, but there are arguments to be made that some of the bigger movers in our hobby, some of the folks with lots of money, or, I'll just say certain cards that are very rare that have recently come under question about how quality of a card they are, well, those are stories that kind of eerily approximate this. Again, you're not going to get a situation where people are doctoring Pokemon cards. I think I've covered in enough detail that it's borderline impossible to do so in a good way. At least to public knowledge. There might be someone out there with the secret sauce, in which case I hope you get caught at some point in the future. But there are other ways that fraud can happen. So a good example would be if a particular Pokemon card got turned down for a BGS 10 in the past that has now suddenly graded a BGS 10, one could raise an argument about why or how. Now, cross-grading is not an uncommon thing. I will go ahead and say that. Cross-grading is also something that sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, but theoretically, if you're consistent enough with resubmitting it, you might get lucky one day. So all this could mean is that someone got lucky one day and the card finally cross-graded the way it should have. There are other situations that play out, and again, this is not an accusation, but rather just me theorizing, but if an additional amount of money was thrown in, or if there was some incentive from a particular grading company to have this card graded because they knew the ramifications of having that very public card graded with a particular grading company, there might be something to consider there from a risk perspective. That's obviously fraud. That's obviously a type of subjectivity that comes into question, and that's definitely something that I have a feeling the FBI would love to learn more about. But, conclusion to the video, well, this is a really weird scenario that played out, and unfortunately it drags in two pretty big names. All of this right now only has to do with the sports card memorabilia. The thing is, PWCC touches a lot of Pokemon cards, and I don't think people are quite aware of how or why it should be a concern if your Pokemon cards came from that auction house. A lot of people are confused about this, and hopefully this video works to show you why the FBI subpoenaed them, why the FBI needed them to cooperate against GaryMoser, and how all of that casts a shadow on transactions they're doing up till today. The other thing to bear in mind is that although this is all sports card memorabilia, we can't really turn our nose up and say, oh, well, it doesn't impact the Pokemon card hobby. It's literally next door. Like, those two hobbies exist under the larger umbrella of trading card memorabilia. And so if you don't think it's going to trickle its way into our hobby, you're willfully ignorant of the way that people work. We saw it last year with scalpers. Baseball cards have been scalped for years. And then once Pokemon became profitable enough that Pokemon could be scalped, scalpers came. And in the same way, if fraudsters exist in other hobbies and then magically Pokemon becomes ripe for fraud, guess what'll happen? We'll see an increase in that type of fraud as well. So it's very, very important that we as a hobby and we as a community are united about this, are communicating about this, and are able to flag and identify this stuff as it comes up. But with all that said, friends, thanks again for checking out another video. If you learned anything new today about PSA, PWCC, Operation Bullpen, and GaryMoser, feel free to leave a like down below on the video. If for one reason or the other the FBI chooses to watch this as a cool way of recapping their Operation Bullpen, or, you know, for any other reason an FBI agent happens to be checking this out, make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to join the Gengar Gang. This way, I get to be one of the cool kid PokeTubers. But seriously, if you want to join the Gengar Gang, that helps. It helps the community grow, so that's always fun. Anywho, thanks as always, friends, for checking out another video. I do hope you learned something today, and I do hope this kicks off a larger conversation, if possible. And yeah, with all that said, thanks again for your viewership, and we will talk soon. Peace.